Claudette Renée Augustin had been opening the restaurant for 21 years. The walk was always the same. She came through the kitchen at 4:30 to check the line, then through the pass-through, then into the dining room to walk the floor before service. She adjusted chairs. She straightened table linen. She checked the candle votives and the floral arrangements and the reservation book and the alignment of the silverware at each place setting. She had done this walk every service day for 21 years, and she had not once walked through her dining room and found it anything less than exactly what she had built it to be. Claudette's was on Hargrove Avenue between 9th and 10th. The name was on a painted wooden sign above the door, and on the front window in gold leaf, and on the awning, and on her chef's whites embroidered over the left breast pocket in the same dark green as the awning. The letters on the sign were 9 inches tall. She had chosen the font herself from a book the sign maker had brought to the restaurant when she had been open for 6 months and was still deciding whether the restaurant would survive. She had chosen the font and had not changed it in 21 years. The sign was the same font. The awning was the same color. The embroidery on her chef's whites was the same thread. She was 57. She had been born in this city in a neighborhood 12 blocks from where she now stood. Her mother, Adeline Augustin, had been a nurse's aide at Hargrove Memorial for 31 years. Her father, Robert Augustin, had driven a number 47 city bus for 28 years. They had come to this city from Port-au-Prince in 1964, which was the year the mayor had declared the neighborhood they moved into a renewal zone, which meant the neighborhood was being discussed at City Hall before Adeline and Robert had learned the bus routes. Her father learned the bus routes in 6 weeks. He eventually drove most of them. She had grown up watching her mother come home from double shifts and make dinner without sitting down. She had grown up watching her father press his uniform on Sunday nights for the week ahead. She had grown up understanding that the relationship between work and what you had to show for it was not always direct. That sometimes the route was longer than the map suggested. She had started cooking at 13. Her mother's kitchen, Hargrove Avenue, the cutting board at the counter, the specific weight of a chef's knife she had not yet earned but held like she had. Her mother had taught her that you did not begin with the difficult things. You began with the correct things, and the difficult things followed because they had to. She had cooked her first full dinner at 15 roast chicken green beans, a potato gratin that she had made twice before the Sunday she served it, because she wanted it right before she served it. Her mother had eaten the whole plate and had not said anything except next time, more time. She had used more time next time. The dish had been correct. She had taken a job at 19 at a neighborhood restaurant called Beaumont's on Vine Street, 2 blocks from her parents' house, and had spent 3 years in the prep corner and on the cold station before the head chef had moved her to hot, and she had spent another 2 years on hot. The head chef at Beaumont's was a man named Harold Grange, 55, who had been cooking since he was 11, and who taught her 2 things she never forgot. The first was, know where everything is before you need it, because when you need it, you will not have time to look. The second was the room teaches you before you are good enough to teach the room. She had spent 5 years at Beaumont's learning where everything was and learning the room. Then she had taken the prep position at Meridian Fine Dining, which was where she had learned what fine dining was in practice, not the version she had read about in the library books she had borrowed when she was 16 and becoming serious about cooking, but the actual version, the version that was a kitchen running at 30 covers a night with 4 courses and a tasting menu and a wine list that the sommelier had built over a decade, the version that was mise en place that could not be questioned because it had to be right, because there was no time to correct it if it was not right. She had been at Meridian for 6 years. She had become sous chef in her 4th year. The executive chef was a woman named Margaret Hollins, 47, who had trained in Lyon and had brought back from Lyon the belief that the quality of a meal was determined 90% in the preparation and 10% in the execution, and that the 10% was only possible because the 90% had been done correctly. She had passed this on to Claudette. She had passed it on not by explaining it, but by running the kitchen the way the kitchen had to run to produce what it was producing, and Claudette had understood by watching and doing and understanding why. When Claudette left Meridian after 6 years to take the sous chef position at Aldridge House, Margaret Hollins had shaken her hand and said, "You're ready." She had meant it as a precise assessment, not as encouragement, and Claudette had received it as a precise assessment, which was how she received everything useful. Aldridge House was 22 covers and prix-fixe only, which meant every seat was a decision and every plate was a commitment. She had been there for 4 years before the loan officer and the conversation and the business plan that she had written in 6 weeks and revised 14 times before she had taken it to the meeting. She had known when she walked into that office that the plan was right. She had also known that knowing something was right was not always sufficient, that sometimes it had to be seen to be known by the person who needed to see it, and she had explained the plan clearly and had answered every question, and had left the meeting with the sense that she had done everything she could do, and that what happened next would happen on the basis of what she had said, and that she had said the right things. She had been 36 when she sat across from the SBA loan officer and explained her business plan. The loan was $40,000. Her mother had co-signed. Before she co-signed, Adeline Augustin had put 19 years of Sunday shift differentials and unused vacation payouts into a savings account at the Hargrove Federal Credit Union and had handed her daughter a cashier's check for $12,000. She had handed it to her at the kitchen table in the house on Vine Street. She had said, "This is what I have. You know what to do with it." Claudette had known what to do with it. The restaurant opened in the spring of 2004 with 14 covers a 3-item menu and a line out the door that she had not expected and had spent the first 2 services being grateful for and terrified by simultaneously. By the 2nd year, it was 22 covers and a 4-item menu. By the 5th year, it was 38 covers and a prix-fixe on Fridays that had a 3-week wait. By the 10th year, the prix-fixe wait was 6 weeks. By the 15th year, she had done a renovation, new floors, new kitchen equipment. The back room she had added for private dining, and the prix-fixe wait was 2 months. And the Sunday brunch was the subject of a magazine feature that she had framed in the hallway but did not point out to anyone. She had 14 staff members. She paid them above the market rate for the category because she believed this was correct and because she had seen what below market rate looked like from the inside, and she did not want her staff to see it from the inside. Her chef de cuisine was Andre Williams, 34, who had been with her for 5 years, and who ran the kitchen on her behalf with the precision and quiet authority of someone who understood that precision and quiet authority were not opposites of warmth. Her front-of-house manager was Sylvia Devereaux, 49, who had been with her for 10 years and who managed the dining room with the specific competence of someone who had memorized every regular seating preference and had never been wrong about when a table needed more water without being asked. On Fridays, they ran a 4-course prix-fixe menu. Service began at 6. The dining room seated 38 with 2 top tables that could be joined for parties of 4. The governor had a reservation for 7:15. Her aide, Calvin Reed, had called 3 days prior. Claudette had taken the call herself because Calvin Reed always called himself, and she appreciated that. The governor had eaten at Claudette's 7 times in 4 years. She ordered the same first course every time, the spring pea soup in season, the roasted beet preparation out of season, and different mains depending on what Claudette told her was best that evening. She had never sent back a plate. Claudette had never needed to resend one. On a Friday in April at 5:47 in the afternoon, Claudette was in her dining room walking the floor. The Hargrove Avenue door was propped open. A delivery had come at 5:30 bread from the bakery on 10th Street, and Jerome Washington, one of her line cooks, had propped the door to bring the delivery in and had not yet unpropped it. The kitchen was running. The reduction was on. She could smell roasted garlic and the char from the grill, and the specific warm yeast smell from the bread she had just received. She could hear Andre's voice from behind the past quiet and even calling times. She could hear the dining room taking its shape for the evening, the quiet settling of a room that is almost ready. Officer Peter Holt entered through the propped door at 5:47. He was 33 years old. He had been on the force for 5 years. He had a corridor patrol assignment on the Hargrove Avenue block that had been created 18 months ago as part of a downtown business district initiative. The stated purpose of the initiative was to increase officer familiarity with the business district and to provide a consistent presence that business owners could rely on. The unstated effect in Holt's portion of the corridor had been 3 incidents in 14 months. He had 2 prior incidents in his record, one from 14 months ago, a stop of a black man outside a dry cleaning business that the dry cleaning business owner had filed a complaint about citing no apparent basis. One from 7 months ago, a complaint from the owner of a hardware store on Meridian describing an interaction in which Holt had questioned who she was and what she was doing in the back of the store she owned, requiring repeated verification before accepting her identification. The hardware store owner was a woman named Patricia Ngozi, 41, who had owned the store for 9 years. She had filed the complaint in writing and had provided a detailed account and had received a letter informing her that the matter had been reviewed and closed. She had not been told that there was an earlier complaint and that hers was the second. She had not been told because the person who reviewed her complaint had not read it in context with the first one. The first complaint had been reviewed by a different officer. The 2 complaints were in the same file and had never been read as a sequence. Both complaints had been reviewed individually and closed without formal action. He entered the restaurant through the propped door and looked around the dining room and walked toward the woman standing at the center table adjusting a candle votive. He said, "Excuse me, what are you doing in here?" Claudette looked up. She was holding the votive in both hands. She set it back on the table. She said, "I'm doing the floor walk before service. I'm the owner." He said, "Can you show me some identification?" She said, "My name is embroidered on my jacket. The restaurant is named for me." He said, "I'd like to see a photo ID." She put her hand in her coat pocket. She did not always carry her wallet in her coat pocket, but she did on Fridays because she sometimes went to the bank before service. She took out her driver's license and held it out to him. He looked at it. He looked at her. He looked at the dining room. He looked back at her. He said, "I received a report of an unauthorized individual on the premises." She said, "I am the owner of this establishment. My name is on the license on my jacket and on the sign above the door. There is nothing unauthorized about my presence here." He said, "I'm going to need you to step outside while I verify." She said, "Verify what?" He said, "The report." She looked at him for a moment. The dining room was quiet. She could hear the kitchen behind her, the sound of work in motion, her kitchen, her staff, her restaurant, the restaurant she had been building for 21 years. She looked at him and she said, "Precisely, this is my restaurant. My name is Claudette Augustin. I have been here for 21 years. You are asking me to step outside my own restaurant." He said, "It's standard procedure when there's a report." She said, "What was the report?" He said, "Suspicious activity." She said the word back to him once. She said, "Suspicious." Then she said, "I'm going to go get my front-of-house manager. Her name is Sylvia Devereaux. She has worked here for 10 years. She can confirm my identity to any standard you require." He said, "I need you to come with me outside." She looked at him. She made a decision about what she was willing to do and what she was not, and she separated them cleanly. She said, "I will step outside. I will not come with you. I am an owner of a business on this block, and I have a right to know the basis of this." She walked to the Hargrove Avenue door, which was still propped, and stepped out onto the sidewalk. Before she reached the door, she had 2 thoughts in the time it takes to cross a dining room. The first thought was about Sylvia, and it was Sylvia knows what to do. She did not need to think this. She knew Sylvia had been managing this dining room for 10 years, and that Sylvia would take the opening of service and handle it correctly the way she handled everything correctly, but she thought it anyway, because it confirmed that the choice she was making was possible. She could step outside. the room would hold. The second thought was about the kitchen, and it was Andre has it. Same confirmation, same certainty. She had built a kitchen that ran correctly without her when it had to, which was not often, but was something she had prepared for, because her mother had taught her that you prepared for the things that were not often but were possible. She crossed the dining room and went through the propped door. Outside it was April at 5:49 in the afternoon. The light on Hargrove Avenue was the specific late afternoon light she had watched through this window for 21 years, golden and low and angled across the storefronts in a way that made everything look amber and lit. She was standing on her own sidewalk in her chef's whites with her name on the chest and the name of her restaurant above her head and an officer standing between her and her restaurant. The light on Hargrove Avenue was gold and low, and she could see it on the windows of the buildings across the street. The same light she had watched from inside the restaurant for 21 years. The light she had watched from the kitchen at the end of service when the dining room was empty, and she was doing the close and the light came through the front window at the angle that meant it was the end of an April day. She had watched that light from inside the restaurant. She was watching it from the outside now. She thought about the first year. She thought about the Friday in October of the first year, when the prix-fixe had sold out for the first time, all 14 covers, and she had run the kitchen herself with one prep cook and a part-time dishwasher, and had sent 14 plates of the same four-course meal to 14 people in the right order, at the right time, and at the right temperature, and at the end of service. She had sat on the floor of the kitchen with her back against the prep table and her legs out in front of her, and she had thought, I can do this. Not as a question and not as a celebration, but as a precise assessment of a situation, the way she assessed everything, the way Margaret Hollins at Meridian had taught her to assess a service, not in terms of how it felt, but in terms of what it produced and whether the production was correct. The production had been correct. She had sat on the kitchen floor and assessed it, and concluded that it was correct and that she could do it again. She had done it again. She had done it 3,041 times, which was the number of service days the restaurant had been open in 21 years, accounting for the week she had closed after her father died, and the 3 days she had closed when the kitchen hood had needed emergency replacement, and the pandemic year when she had pivoted to takeout and had run takeout service for 11 months before reopening for indoor dining. She had counted the service days once on the restaurant's 20th anniversary and had noted the number, the way you note a distance you have walked as information about what had been covered and what the covering had cost and produced. She did not call anyone. She did not raise her voice. She stood on the step and she noted the time 5:49, and she noted his name from his badge, which was Holt P. Holt. And she noted what he was saying, and she noted the fact that he had not given her a clear explanation of the report, and she noted that the explanation he had given suspicious activity was not an explanation but a category, and that the category required a specific observation to generate a call, and that the specific observation had not been communicated to her. She noted that he had asked her to step outside, and that she had stepped outside because the alternative was a conflict that would produce less useful information than her compliance would produce. She was noting everything. She had a very good memory, which she had developed in professional kitchens where remembering was not optional because nothing could be looked up at the moment you needed it. You had to have it available because the moment required it. And she applied that memory now to the sidewalk in front of her restaurant at 5:49 on a Friday in April. She was also thinking about the votive on table 3. She had set it down when she looked up at the officer, and she was not certain it was in exactly the right position. This was not important in the context of what was happening on the sidewalk, but it was where her mind went when it was not occupied with the situation, the way her mind always went to the restaurant when it had a moment of not being required for something else. She was standing outside her restaurant, and her mind was inside it, checking the tables, running through the prep list, thinking about the governor's reservation at 7:15 and whether the spring pea soup was ready and whether the risotto reduction had been started in time. She had built the restaurant in her mind long before she built it on Hargrove Avenue. She carried it with her everywhere. She was carrying it now standing on the step while the officer consulted his radio. She waited. Sylvia Devereaux appeared at the door within 40 seconds. She had seen Claudette step outside and had understood immediately that the situation required her presence. She opened the door and stepped out and said, "Officer, I'm Sylvia Devereaux. I'm the front-of-house manager here. This is Claudette Augustin. She owns this restaurant." He said, "I'm not addressing you right now." Sylvia said, "I understand. I'm offering you information." He said, "Step back inside." Sylvia did not step back inside. She stood in the doorway. She said nothing further. She was present. She was noting what was happening with the same precision Claudette was using. Sylvia Devereaux went back through the door and stood at the host stand. She had a party of 4 arriving at 6 o'clock and a party of 2 at 6:15, and she had the governor's table confirmed for 7:15, and she had service beginning in 11 minutes. She had worked with Claudette for 10 years, and she had never seen what she had just seen, and she was not going to allow what she had seen to prevent the service from beginning correctly. She picked up the phone at the host stand and called the reservation number and confirmed the 6 o'clock party of 4, and then she went to check the wine station. And then she went to confirm with the server on for the evening, Imani Clark, 22, first year at Claudette's, that the tables were set correctly. Imani said they were. Sylvia checked them herself. They were. She went back to the host stand. At 6 o'clock, the 6 o'clock party of 4 arrived. Sylvia took them to their table and handed them the menus and told them about the prix-fixe and the evening selections and said that their server would be right with them. She did not say that the owner was currently on the sidewalk outside having a conversation with an officer. She said, "We're very glad you're here." She brought them water. The party of 2 arrived at 6:08. She seated them at table 7. She said, "We're very glad you're here." She brought them water. At the pass-through window inside, Jerome Washington had paused with a sheet pan in both hands and was watching through the glass. He was 28 and had been at Claudette's for 2 years and had cooked professionally since he was 22, and he had never seen the owner of a restaurant he worked in standing on the sidewalk outside her own restaurant in her chef's whites before service talking to a police officer. He watched for about 90 seconds, and then he set the sheet pan down and took out his phone and filmed through the window for 4 minutes. Then Sylvia looked through the glass and he put the phone away and picked up the sheet pan and went back to work. But he had filmed 4 minutes. Inside the kitchen, Andre Williams heard none of this because the pass-through window faced the dining room, and he was at the back of the kitchen checking the risotto reduction, which needed another 12 minutes. He ran the kitchen the way he had been running it for 5 years, which was the way Claudette had taught him to run it in sequence without deviation, with the understanding that the sequence was correct, and that deviation from the sequence was the cause of most problems, and that most problems were therefore preventable if the sequence was maintained. He maintained the sequence. He called times. He checked temperatures. He walked the line at 5:58 and said 2 minutes. His voice was the voice of a chef de cuisine at 6 o'clock on a Friday in a kitchen that runs correctly, which is not a raised voice and is not a quiet voice, but is the voice that exactly carries to every station without effort, the voice of a room that is about to produce something. He did not know Claudette was outside. He found out at 7:20 when she came through the door of the kitchen and said, "How are we?" He said, "We are good." She said, "I know." She picked up her spoon. Andre Williams heard none of what happened on the sidewalk until service was over. He heard it from Sylvia after the kitchen had broken down. He sat in the back room with a glass of water and listened to what she described and said nothing for a moment. Then he said she was outside for 22 minutes. Sylvia said yes. He said, and the kitchen ran. Sylvia said yes. He said she built it to run. Sylvia said, "I know." He said, I know she did. He said it as a confirmation of something he had already understood, which was that the kitchen running correctly during the 22 minutes was not an accident and was not luck, but was the result of 21 years of Claudette building something that could hold without her for 22 minutes when it had to. He sat with this for a moment, and then he said, "I'll finish the breakdown." He ran the kitchen the way he always ran it. He called times. He checked the mise en place. He walked the line at 5:58 and said 2 minutes. The kitchen came to attention the way it always did. At 6 o'clock, Andre Williams said service, and the kitchen started. Claudette was still outside. She was standing on the step of her own restaurant at 6 o'clock on a Friday, and her kitchen was running without her because she had built it to run correctly. And she was standing on the step and she was thinking about her mother's check for $12,000, which she had framed after the mortgage on the restaurant was paid and had hung in the kitchen where she could see it. She was thinking about the walk she had just been doing. She was thinking about the votive she had set back on the center table and whether it was aligned. She was thinking about the governor's reservation for 7:15. She was thinking that she was going back inside. She was absolutely going back inside. She was thinking about when. A woman passed on the sidewalk at 6:04 and stopped and looked and said, "Are you all right?" Claudette said yes. "Thank you." The woman did not leave immediately. She said, "Is that your restaurant?" Claudette said yes. The woman took out her phone. She filmed the situation from the sidewalk for about a minute, the footage showing Claudette in her chef's whites, with her name embroidered on the chest and the restaurant name on the awning above her head, and the officer standing in front of her. Then the woman walked on. She posted the footage on a neighborhood social media group at 6:11. By 6:40, it had been shared 14 times. At 7:15, the governor's motorcade pulled up on Hargrove Avenue. Governor Sandra Ruth Ellison was 62. She had served as the state's attorney general for 8 years before being elected governor in the most recent election cycle. She had been a litigation attorney before that. She had the reputation among people who worked with her and people who worked against her of someone who read the situation with precision and said what was accurate and did not say more than the situation required. Her aide Calvin Reed was the first one out of the second car. He walked to the restaurant entrance and stopped when he saw Claudette on the sidewalk. He had met Claudette 3 times on each occasion when he had come in ahead of the governor's arrival to confirm the reservation, and he recognized her immediately, the chef's whites, the dark green embroidery, the specific composure of a woman who was standing on a sidewalk when she should have been inside. He turned back to the governor's car. He opened the rear door. The governor stepped out and he said quietly, "Governor, this is Claudette Augustin. She owns this restaurant." The governor looked at Claudette. She looked at the officer. She walked to the sidewalk. She said, "I'm Sandra Ellison. This is Claudette Augustin. I'd like to understand the situation." The officer said, "Governor, I'm handling a suspicious activity report." She said, "I can see that. What is the basis of the report?" He said, "I received a call about an unauthorized individual on the premises." She said, "This is Ms. Augustin's restaurant. Her name is on the sign. Her name is on her jacket. What is the basis for your continued detention of her?" There was a pause. She said, "I'm going to ask you once more, what is the basis?" He said, "I'm in the process of verifying." She said, "Verifying what?" He said, "The report." She said, "The report described an unauthorized individual. You have been presented with a photo ID, a business owner's front-of-house manager, and the name of the business, which matches the name embroidered on this woman's clothing and the name on the sign above the door. What specifically remains unverified?" He had no answer for this that was sufficient for the question. She said, "I would like you to allow Ms. Augustin to return to her restaurant." He said, "Yes, Governor." Claudette Augustin went back through the door of her restaurant at 7:19. She had been outside for 22 minutes. The dining room was in service. 5 tables were occupied. Imani Clark was at the server station with her order pad. Sylvia was at the host stand. The wine service was running. The water had been refilled at every table. She walked through the dining room and looked at each occupied table and assessed what she saw. People eating, people talking, people at ease in a room that was functioning correctly. She walked through the pass-through without stopping. In the kitchen, she went to the sink and washed her hands with the concentration she brought to every task that required 2 hands, which was most tasks in a kitchen. She dried her hands on the towel at her station, and she picked up her tasting spoon, and she walked the line. Andre Williams was at the pass. He had heard her come in. He looked up and said, "Chef." She said, "How are we?" He said, "We are good." She said, "Table 5's risotto." He said, "3 minutes." She said, "Good." She walked the line from the hot station to the grill to the cold station, and she tasted what needed tasting and adjusted what needed adjusting and said nothing that was not required. She was back. The kitchen knew she was back not because she announced it, but because the kitchen always knew when she was in it. The quality of attention in the room shifted. It was not that it had been insufficient. Andre had been running it correctly, but it shifted the way a room shifts when the person who built it returns to it. The room recognized her, and she recognized the room. At the end of service, she went to every table and thanked the guests and checked that they had been given everything they wanted. She did this at every service. She did it with the same attention she brought to the dining room walk before service, which was the same attention she had brought to everything she had built in the restaurant for 21 years, which was the same attention her mother had brought to 19 years of Sunday shifts and savings that became $12,000 that became the restaurant. Her restaurant had been in service for 79 minutes when she returned through the door. She did not process what had happened on the sidewalk until later. This was a choice she made consciously, the way you choose your footing on a difficult surface, deliberately and without drama. The restaurant was in service. Her staff was running it. She was back. She would process it when the processing was appropriate. Right now, the appropriate thing was service. There was a rhythm to a service that she had internalized over 21 years the way a musician internalizes a piece, not by remembering what came next, but by being in the piece and trusting that the next thing would come because she had practiced it enough that it was part of her. She moved through the service the way she always moved through a service, which was completely. She did not move through the service thinking about the sidewalk. She moved through the service thinking about the risotto and the fish and the timing of the cheese course and whether the bread service was being maintained and whether the table near the window needed their water glasses refilled. She was in the service. The service was what mattered. She would think about the sidewalk when the service was over. When the service was over and the kitchen was breaking down and the dining room was empty, she sat at the table nearest the host stand, which was not table 1 or table 2 or table 4, but table 9. The one she sat at when she needed to sit and think, and she thought about what had happened. She thought about it in sequence, the way she thought about anything she needed to understand. Beginning at the beginning, moving to the middle, arriving at the end. The beginning was 5:47. The middle was the 22 minutes. The end was the door. She had gone back through the door. That was the end. Everything else was what the end required and how to get there. The governor sat at table 4, which was the corner table that seated 4, though she was dining with only her aide Calvin Reed and one member of her security detail who sat at the adjacent table 2 and did not eat. She ordered the spring pea soup and the duck confit and the cheese course. She ordered the same burgundy she always ordered, which Claudette kept in stock for exactly this reason. She did not ask for anything special. She ate what was served, and she finished what she was served, and she said nothing further about what had happened on the sidewalk, except once at the end of the meal when Claudette came to the table to check on them, which she did for every table at the end of service. The governor said Ms. Augustine, the duck, was exactly right. And then she said, "I'll be in touch." She was in touch the following Tuesday. Her office sent a formal letter to the police department's Public Safety Review Board, documenting what she had witnessed on the sidewalk in front of Claudette's on Hargrove Avenue on a Friday evening in April. The letter described the situation in 3 paragraphs. It did not editorialize. It described what she had observed. It described the questions she had asked and the answers she had received. It noted that at the time she arrived, Claudette Augustin had been outside her own business for 19 minutes without a satisfactory explanation of the basis for her detention. It concluded by requesting a documented review of the incident and a written response to the governor's office within 30 days. The written response came in 22 days. The review had found 2 prior incidents in Holt's file that were relevant to the pattern. One from 14 months ago, one from 7 months ago. Taken individually as they had been taken, they had not established a documented pattern. The person who reviewed the first complaint had not noted it in a way that would flag it for the reviewer of the second. The person who reviewed the second complaint had not gone back to look for prior incidents in the same category before closing the complaint as unsubstantiated. There was no protocol that required them to do so. The absence of that protocol was what the review addressed. Taken with the April incident, the 2 prior complaints established a pattern that the review found well documented and concerning. The review board met on 3 occasions over 10 days. The review board included a civilian oversight representative and a community relations officer and the department's training director. The training director had been in her position for 8 years and had seen patterns emerge from files that had been reviewed correctly, and had also seen patterns fail to emerge from files that had been reviewed incorrectly, and she could tell the difference in about 20 minutes of reading. She had been reading Holt's file for 22 minutes when she had identified the 3 incidents as related. She had flagged them for the full board review. The review recommended a 30-day suspension reassignment from the Hargrove Avenue Corridor Patrol and mandatory training in commercial premises protocols. It also recommended a new operational protocol for suspicious activity calls at commercial premises during business hours, which was developed over the following 6 weeks and included, among other provisions, a requirement that the officer responding to a suspicious activity call at an operating business verify the business ownership status before any request for the individual to vacate the premises. The protocol also required that all complaints in the same category from the same officer be reviewed as a sequence before any individual complaint was closed. This was the provision that had not existed before. This was the provision that had allowed 3 complaints to be closed individually when they should have been read together. Holt's 2 prior complainants were notified of the review outcome. The dry cleaning business owner had closed his complaint and moved on. He had moved on not because the complaint had been addressed, but because he had assessed the situation and concluded that pursuing it would cost him more than he could afford to spend, which was a calculation he had made with clarity and without drama, the way people make calculations that are not fair to have to make. He received the review outcome letter and read it and put it in a folder and did not respond. The hardware store owner had not closed hers. Her name was Patricia Ngozi. She had owned the store for 9 years. She had filed her complaint in writing and had received the letter saying it was closed, and had spent 7 months knowing that the situation was unresolved and being unable to say how she knew because she had been told it was resolved. When the review office called, she said, "I know. I know it happened again. I know because it will keep happening until someone reads all of it at once." The review officer on the call wrote that sentence down verbatim and brought it to the next board meeting and read it aloud. The training director said, "That is the protocol." The community relations officer said, "That is exactly the protocol." The protocol that was developed over the following 6 weeks was in its essential structure the thing that Patricia Ngozi had articulated in one sentence to the review office on a Tuesday morning. Patricia Ngozi received a written summary of the review outcome and the new protocol. She read it and called the review office and asked to speak with the officer who had taken her call. The officer was not available. She left a message. She said, "I'm glad they read them together. I'm glad it only took 3. The review officer wrote that sentence in her notes from the call. It appeared in paraphrased form in the final section of the new protocol document, in the paragraph about why sequential complaint review was now standard for incidents at commercial premises. The sentence said patterns that are invisible in individual incidents become visible when the incidents are read in sequence. Claudette was asked to speak to the community advisory board that had been convened to review the new protocol. She agreed. She came to the board meeting on a Wednesday evening in May, which was her one closed day, and she sat at the table with 9 board members and spoke for 28 minutes. She spoke without notes. She described the incident and the 22 minutes and what she had noted and what she had concluded. She described what she had built and how she had built it and how long she had been building it. She described what the suspension of that building required, which was what 22 minutes on the sidewalk had required, not the suspension of the building itself, but the suspension of her role in it, the trust that the building would hold while she was required to be somewhere else. She took 7 questions. The first question was about the prior complaints and whether she had been aware of them. She said she had not been aware of them. She said she was aware of them now and that she believed the new protocol was the correct response to the way in which they had been reviewed before. The second question was about the Hargrove Avenue corridor patrol and whether she had had interactions with corridor officers before. She said she had had no prior interactions with corridor officers and that the Hargrove Avenue presence had in general been consistent with the corridor patrol's stated purpose. She was careful to say in general. She said it as a qualification that meant what it said, not more. The 7th question was the last question, and it was the one she had spent time with afterward. She took 7 questions. She was precise and clear. She did not say anything she had not already said to herself alone on the step of her restaurant on a Friday in April, standing in her chef's whites, with her name on the chest and the name of her restaurant on the sign above her head, and 21 years of work behind her, and a kitchen running correctly and a service she intended to get back to. The last question she was asked was from a woman on the board who had been on the neighborhood council for 18 years, and who said, "What would you want the officer to have understood if he could have understood it in that moment?" Claudette thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "The building is named for me. The jacket is named for me. I have been on this block for 21 years. The uniform is not the only credential that matters in any given room." There was a pause after she said this. She said he could have looked at the sign. Afterward, she went back to the restaurant and walked the floor before the Tuesday dinner service. She adjusted the centerpiece on table 3. She checked the candle votives. She looked at the alignment of the silverware and found it correct. She walked through the pass-through and into the kitchen, and she said, "How are we?" Andre Williams said, "We are good." She said, "Good." She went to the back of the kitchen and stood for a moment in front of the frame on the wall. The cashier's check her mother had written was inside the frame under glass. The date was spring 2004. The amount was $12,000. Her mother's name was on the check, and her own name was on the check, and the memo line said the restaurant. Her mother had written it in the memo line herself. The restaurant. She looked at the check for a moment, and then she turned around and went back to the line. Her mother had died in 2019. She had been in the dining room for the last meal Adeline Augustin had eaten at Claudette's a Sunday brunch in February, 6 months before she died, and she had sat at table 2, which was Claudette's personal favorite table because of the light from the front window at 11 in the morning, and she had eaten the French toast preparation and the poached egg and drunk 2 cups of coffee. Afterward, Claudette had come to the table and her mother had looked around the dining room with the specific attention of someone cataloging something they know they may need to remember later. And she had said, "You did this right." She had not meant the French toast. She had meant the restaurant. She had meant the check and the 21 years and the 14 staff members and the 6-week prix-fixe wait and the governor coming in on Fridays. She had meant all of it. Claudette had driven her mother home after that Sunday brunch. It was February, and the light was the specific, flat, gray-white of winter in this city. The light she had grown up inside, and that she thought of as a kind of baseline. the light that everything else departed from when it was better or worse. She had helped her mother into the house on Vine Street, the house she had grown up in, and had made her another cup of coffee at the kitchen counter. The same kitchen where she had cut vegetables at 13, the same counter, the same view out the window to the backyard, and her mother had sat at the kitchen table in the same chair she had always sat in and had drunk the coffee and had said, "I'm tired today." Claudette had said, "I know." Her mother had said, "I'm glad we went." She had said it about the Sunday brunch, and she had meant it about everything. Claudette had sat across from her at the kitchen table and had said, "I know, Mama. I am too." 6 months later, Adeline Augustin had died on a Thursday morning in August at Hargrove Memorial, the hospital where she had been a nurse's aide for 31 years and where she had gone 3 times a week for dialysis for the last 2 years of her life. Claudette had been in the kitchen at the restaurant when the call came. She had been at the sink, which was where she often was, at 8 in the morning, and she had answered the phone and had stood at the sink for a moment after the call, and had then gone to find Sylvia and had said, "I need to close today." Sylvia had said, "I know." She had closed the restaurant for 3 days. On the 4th day she had come back and done the floor walk before service and had said, "Let's go." After the advisory board meeting and after the 30-day suspension, and after the new protocol was in place, the governor came back to Claudette's on a Thursday evening in June, not a Friday, which was prix-fixe, but a Thursday, which was a la carte. She came in without a reservation, which she had never done before, and Sylvia Devereaux looked up from the host stand and said "Governor" one moment and seated her at table 4, which she had been holding for a regular who had canceled at 3 that afternoon. The governor ordered the spring vegetable terrine and the grilled fish and did not ask for the menu. She said, "Tell me what's good tonight." Claudette came out of the kitchen to tell her. She said the fish. The governor said the fish. They stood in the dining room for a moment. Not long, the governor and the woman whose restaurant she was standing in, and the governor said, "How are you?" "How are—" Claudette said, "I'm good. We're in service." The governor said, "I know you are." She went back to her table. Claudette went back to her kitchen. The Thursday service ran correctly from 6 o'clock to 9:15. At the end of service, Claudette stood in the kitchen while Andre and the line broke down the station, and she listened to the familiar sound of her kitchen at the end of a good night, the clattering and the conversation and the specific tired ease of people who had run something well and knew it. And she thought about the step outside the April light, the 22 minutes, the name above the door. She thought about her mother pressing her hand flat on the cashier's check before she handed it across the kitchen table in 2004 and saying, "This is what I have. You know what to do with it." She had known what to do with it. She had put it in the restaurant. She had put 21 years in the restaurant. She had put the walk before service and the prix-fixe on Fridays and the embroidery on her chef's whites, and the font on the sign, and the correct positioning of the silverware, and the knowledge of which table had the best morning light, and what each regular ordered, and when each regular needed water without being asked. She had put her name on the sign 9 inches tall, and her name on the jacket in dark green thread, and her name on the check on the wall in the back of the kitchen in her mother's handwriting in the memo line, the restaurant. She turned off the kitchen light at 9:47. She locked the Hargrove Avenue door. She stood outside for a moment in the the June evening air on the step where she had stood in April, and she looked up at her sign. 9-inch letters, the same font she had chosen from the book in 2004. The sign was exactly right. She walked to her car. She drove home. She made a cup of tea at the kitchen table, and she thought about the following Friday's prix-fixe menu, and whether the spring pea soup was still right, or whether she should move to the early summer preparation, and she decided it was still right. She wrote down 2 menu notes. She went to bed. In the morning, she got up and drove to the restaurant and went through the kitchen and through the pass-through and into the dining room and began the walk. The centerpiece on table 3 was slightly off. She straightened it. The candle votive on table 7 was a 1/4 inch left of center. She centered it. The alignment of the silverware at table 1 was correct. She moved through the dining room the way she had moved through it for 21 years, steadily, precisely, without speed and without hesitation. And when she reached the center of the room, she stopped and looked at the dining room, the way you look at something you built and are still building. The way you look at something that has your name on it and that will have your name on it, and that is in every visible way exactly what it is supposed to be. Then she walked back through the pass-through and into her kitchen and said, "Let's go." Jerome Washington had not planned to film anything on the Friday in April. He had been carrying the sheet pan because that was what he had been doing before he stopped and looked through the pass-through window. He had stopped because he had seen Claudette step outside and had understood that this was not a normal departure from the dining room. She did not step outside before service. She stepped through the kitchen to the back office. If she needed a moment, she never went out the front door before service, unless there was a specific reason and the understanding that this was not normal had stopped him. He had watched for 90 seconds through the pass-through window and had set the sheet pan down and taken out his phone and begun filming without deciding to the way you do something, the necessity of which is apparent before the decision catches up with it. He had filmed the sidewalk scene from the pass-through window with the specific steadiness of someone who had worked in professional kitchens for 6 years and had steady hands, and the footage was clear enough to identify Claudette, to identify the officer, to read the name embroidered on her chef's whites, and to see the awning above the door behind her. He had filmed for 4 minutes, and then Sylvia had looked through the pass-through, and he had stopped because he was in the kitchen on a Friday evening at 6 o'clock, and the kitchen required him. He put the phone in his pocket and picked up the sheet pan and went back to work. He had sent the footage to Sylvia that night after service because he was uncertain what to do with it, and because Sylvia was the person in the restaurant he most trusted to know what should be done with things. Sylvia had watched the 4 minutes and had called Claudette at 11:15 after service and had said, "Jerome has footage." Claudette had said, "I'll come look at it." She had come to the restaurant the following morning, a Saturday, her second day of service, and had watched the 4 minutes of footage that Jerome Washington had filmed through the pass-through window with a sheet pan set down on the counter beside him. She had said, "Thank you for doing that." Jerome had said, of course. The footage was released through the governor's office communications team on the Tuesday following the incident, along with a statement from the governor's office, and was on 2 local television outlets and 4 local online news outlets by Tuesday evening. In the spring following the incident, the police department released the findings of the protocol review to the public. The findings included the new sequential complaint review standard, which required that any officer with 2 or more prior complaints in the same category have those complaints reviewed as a sequence before a 3rd incident was closed. The findings also included the new commercial premises protocol, which specified the verification steps required before requesting an individual to vacate an operating business. The findings were 3 pages. The appendix was 7 pages. Claudette received a copy by mail. She read it at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning with a cup of coffee. She read all 10 pages. She thought it was correct. She thought it was what it needed to be. She thought it was not sufficient, and she thought it was necessary, and she thought it was what had been done, and that it was better that it had been done than that it had not. She put the document in a folder in her filing cabinet under P for policy. Then she washed her cup and drove to the restaurant for Sunday brunch. Jerome Washington's 4-minute footage filmed through the pass-through window with a sheet pan set down on the counter beside him was the footage that the local outlets used in their evening coverage. The passerby's 1-minute footage was also used. Combined, they showed Claudette on the sidewalk in her chef's whites, precise and still with her name on her jacket and the restaurant name above the door, and the officer between her and the door of her own restaurant. And then they showed the governor arriving and asking the questions Claudette had already asked, and then they showed Claudette going back through the door. Jerome had not planned to film. He had set the sheet pan down because his hands were occupied and because he was watching through the glass and he had thought, I need to have this. He had not known what he would do with it. He had filmed for 4 minutes and then Sylvia had looked at him and he had stopped because the kitchen needed him and because the footage was there if it needed to be there. It needed to be there. He put the phone back in his pocket and picked up the sheet pan and went back to work. Later, after the review was complete and the protocol was published and the footage had been on the local news and the advisory board had met and Claudette had spoken for 28 minutes and the governor had come back on a Thursday evening. In June, Jerome was breaking down his station at the end of a Saturday service when Claudette came through the kitchen and said, "Good service tonight." She said it to the whole line and then she stopped at his station and said, "Jerome." He said, "Chef." She said, "Good service." He said, "Thank you." She said, "When I was outside in April." He said, "Yes." She said, "You put the sheet pan down." He said, "Yes." She said, "Thank you." He said, "I picked it back up." She said, "I know." She moved on down the line. He finished breaking down his station and went home. 6 months after the Friday in April, Claudette was in her dining room at 5:47 in the afternoon, doing the walk before service. The Hargrove Avenue door was closed tonight. It was October, and the air was cold. The kitchen was running. She could hear it through the pass-through. The reduction was on. She could smell the garlic and the char and the bread. She walked the floor the way she had walked it every service day for 21 years. Table 3. The centerpiece was correct. Table 7. The votive was centered. Table 1. The silverware was aligned. She walked through the dining room and she checked everything. And she found everything correct, and she walked back through the pass-through and into her kitchen, and she said, "Let's go." Andre Williams said, "Yes, chef." The kitchen went to work. She had been 57 years old for 4 months. She had been on Hargrove Avenue for 21 years. She had 14 staff members and a 6-week prix-fixe wait and a governor who called ahead through her aide and ordered what she was told was best and did not send back plates. She had her mother's cashier's check in a frame in the kitchen and her name on the sign, 9 inches tall, and her name on the awning, and her name on the door and her name on her chef's whites in dark green thread. She had all of this, and she had the dining room walk and the floor before service and the kitchen at the end of a good night breaking down correctly. She had 3,041 service days and 1 sidewalk in April, and the specific knowledge of what it felt like to go back through the door. Subscribe our channel. We follow the people who come back through the door and say, "Let's go." Like this video if it moved you. Share it with someone who needs to hear this. Comment your thoughts or similar experiences.